Can somebody confirm you can hear me?
I can hear you.
Great. My computer is still making the lecture file, so my computer is going to be a little slow. Hopefully that'll finish in the next 10 or 15 minutes or less. Oh, here's my share screen. Let me call back the syllabus. All right, I don't need to talk about any of this stuff here because I've already talked about it. Your grade will be handled separately in the lab, but they will be combined because both classes are together. Let's talk a little bit about microscope use in the virtual lab. We do have some virtual labs. All of our labs will be online. So you will not be using a real microscope. However, you are expected to know how to use a real microscope and how to take care of a real microscope. And we'll talk about that more when we talk about the microscopes in the lab, meaning one lab will be on using microscopes. It's not today. Let's talk about the lab safety rules. The lab safety rules don't really apply to us because we're going to be carrying our lab online, but you do need to know how to be safe if you were to go into a real microbiology lab because you're going to be hopefully working with patients and you should use some of the principles you learn in microbiology when you're working with these patients, and then you would not be spreading their germs around to other patients. So we're not physically going to meet in the lab, but we are expecting you to know the required course components. And many nursing programs report that safety is one of the main skills that they want their students to learn. Safety is of primary importance in a microbiology lab. How students work, the attitudes and actions uh, contribute to the safety level around them. So develop a positive and respectful attitude towards microorganisms. Never take shortcuts for risk the safety and accuracy. Not only could you infect yourself, you can infect the lab, you can infect other students if you were to actually be in a real microbiology lab. So you're not allowed to take any personal items to the lab bench. They must remain in your bag in a space provided for bags. I'll call it a cubby hole. It's a little cabinet. All required equipment, paper, pens, will be provided for you in the lab. And all of that stuff in the lab proper must not be taken out of the lab. It cannot be taken out of the lab until it's been disinfected. Only enrolled microbiology students are permitted in the lab unless authorized by the instructor. All personnel items, including but not limited to books, bags, purses, cell phones, coats, must be stored in a cabinet near the door. This cabinet and the door are considered external to the lab. So you need to walk, I don't know, a foot or two further, and then you enter the lab proper. So the door is not where the lab begins. Is that clear to everyone? When you walk in the door of the microbiology lab, you're not in the lab yet. until you walk a few feet into the lab. We consider the door and the cabinet area to be outside of the lab. And everything that you bring personal into the lab should be put into the cabinet. You then walk a few feet further, wash your hands, and now you're in the lab proper. Cell phones must not be used in the lab. If you were to get a call, you would first have to take off your gloves, take off your lab coat, we'll go wash your hands, go grab your phone, and then take your phone outside before you could answer and speak on a cell phone. You would then put the phone back in your, I don't know, book bag or your cabinet, go wash your hands, put on your lab coat, put on your gloves. So generally, cell phones cannot be used in the lab. And if they were to be used inside the lab, I would confiscate it and you would not get it back until it had been sterilized, either by putting in bleach for 15 minutes or in the autoclave, also for 15 minutes. Either procedure would destroy your cell phone. So anything that's taken into the lab proper would be confiscated and you would not get it back until it had been cleaned by autoclaving or bleach. You are allowed to take some personal items into the lab if you are wearing them, such as jewelry, watches, glasses, hearing aids. When you're in the lab with these items, you should not touch them with your gloved hands, for example. But you are allowed to take some personal items if you're wearing them. Obviously, your clothes would be personal items, and you're allowed to take your clothes into the lab. All cultures you're going to be working with should be considered potentially pathogenic. Keep hands, pencils, and other materials out of your mouth, ears, nose, etc. There's no eating, no drinking, no smoking, no gum chewing, or any other oral habit allowed in the microbiology lab. When you're in the lab, you must always wear, in the lab proper, you must always wear gloves, and they're provided for you in the lab. You also are required to wear a lab coat. You may either buy a lab coat from the bookstore and bring it to the lab on the first day. Once it's brought into the lab, it stays in the lab for the rest of the term. You never take it home. If you do want it back, and you may use a lab coat that we provide in the lab. If you wanted to take your lab coat back with you at the end of the term, you would put it in a special location, give it to your instructor, put it in a special location. It will be washed. Let me think about this. It'll be autoclaved and then washed, and then you can take it home. That's the only way you can take the lab coat home. You must wear a lab coat. You must wear closed-toed shoes while you're in the lab. So when you come to the lab, you're allowed to wear something like thongs or sandals or a woman's fancy open-toed shoes, but then you must change into a closed-toed shoe. The reason is that closed-toed shoes provide minimum protection for your feet. An open-toed shoe or sandals would not, and so they're not allowed in the lab. The protection is you may spill liquid culture containing microbes, and we don't want that getting on your feet. So you must wear closed-toed shoes. A lab coat must be completely buttoned. You must wear gloves. When there is a splash hazard, such as you're working with a dye or you're working with a liquid culture, you must wear goggles to protect your eyes from the splash hazard. The goggles are supplied by the lab, and after you're using them, they would be sterilized with UV light. Cleanliness is a virtue in a microbiology lab. Before you begin any lab work, you should disinfect the area around you're going to be working with on the lab bench. And then after you're done, you should also disinfect the lab bench. You should also wash your hands before as soon as you enter the lab and after you are done working in the lab, but before you leave the door, meaning before you leave the lab. Proper hand washing should be done. You should also note where fire extinguishers are, fire blanket, eye wash station, first aid materials are located. That's not terribly important because we're an online class, but if you were to come into the lab, you should know where that stuff is. And you should know that in a microbiology lab, we have these safety equipment, like a fire extinguisher. Accidents should be reported to instructor. Minor accidents should be cleaned as follows. Always clean broken glass first. Never handle broken glass with your hands, even if they're gloved. Always handle broken glass with a broom and a dustpan. Remove the broken glass and put it in the broken glass container. We have a little bin for putting broken glass. If you have a strong acid or base, it should be diluted, wiped up quickly. We don't actually use acids or bases in microbiology. A spilled bacterial culture should be cleaned up this way. You cover the spilled material with paper towels. You then drench the paper towels with table disinfectant. Let this disinfectant sit for 15 minutes before wiping them up. You then remove the broken glass first and then use paper towels, dry paper towels, to wipe up the spilled culture. Discard all the material in the biohazard trash can, the exception being the broken glass goes in the broken glass container. You never put glass in the biohazard trash can. Any question about any of that? All right, keep hair and paper away from Bunsen burners and back to incinerators. You should tie long hair back. So when you come into the lab, we have little hair ties. If you don't have your hair tied, you should grab a hair tie and tie it back if it's long hair. Gas incinerators and back to incinerators should be turned off when they're not in use, and they should be turned off before you leave the lab. Mouth pipetting is not allowed. You're never allowed to take cultures out of the lab. To bring a culture into the lab, you must get permission from your instructor before bringing a culture into the lab. If you have a cut or a sore on your hand, you should wash your hands normally. And then go to the first aid kit, grab a Band-Aid, put on the Band-Aid, and then put the glove over the Band-Aid. Before you leave, remove your gloves. Go wash your hands. You may pull off the Band-Aid and go put on a fresh Band-Aid, and then you may leave the lab. All microbial cultures must be completely labeled with your name, the date, the nature of the specimen, and the medium used. It's optional to put the temperature of your culture also. Old specimens must be discarded in the following ways. Agar plates, which are only in a plastic container, are discarded in the biohazard container. We don't have agar plates, we have glass plates. Glass slides should be put in the glass slide container. It's a disinfectant, has disinfectant in it. The cotton swab should be put in a cotton swab container. It also has disinfectant. Pipettes should be put in the appropriate label container, meaning we have a place for plastic pipettes and glass pipettes. The glass pipettes will be autoclaved, washed, and then reused. The plastic pipettes will just be discarded. They'll be autoclaved and then discarded. Glass test tubes should have the labeling removed, meaning tape removed, and then they should be placed in an upright test tube rack for the discard bin of the test tubes. Any questions about any of this discarding? Once again, in the biohazard container, you never put glass in it. Even if it's contaminated with microbes, the glass goes elsewhere. Broken glass in the broken glass container, the test tubes in the test tube rack, the glass pipettes in the used pipette container. Any question about any of that? All right, supplies used for the lab will be at the front of the lab. Each pair of students will be assigned to work in a lab bench, and you'd get a lab bench. It'll have paper and pencils and maybe pens in it. And you may use that lab bench as your little storage area for stuff that is in the lab. Remember that where you have your bags stored, including your coat, your books, is considered outside the lab. And so when you leave the lab, you would first deglove, actually take off your lab coat, deglove, go wash your hands, and then grab your things, and then go outside the door. Any questions about any of that? All right, you are required to follow all these rules. Even though we're not going into the lab, I'll be testing you on some of them. All right, any question about the lab? Safety rules and other stuff? If not, let's go on to talking about Lab 00. We will cover Lab 00 today, lab safety training. Remember, this lab worksheet must be turned in by 8 a.m. Friday morning, April 12th, or you will be dropped from the class. I have to submit who's been attending my class by 5 p.m. on Friday. And between 8 and 5, I'll go in and see who's turned in the assignments, and anyone who has not will be dropped from the class. Any question about any of that? All right, Lab 01, we'll talk about next Thursday, this coming Thursday. All right, let's go on to Lab 00. Oh, I forgot the recording's done. All right, let's, my computer's now going to work a little faster. Yeah, I did click on that. It's not working anymore. You see, yeah, that's the new in-class module. All right. I need to make a new one of that. All right. If you were to go into a real lab, real microbiology lab, anyone working in an observed unsafe manner in the lab would be banned from working in the lab. You could hurt yourself and hurt others as well. Online students are not going to work in the lab, but you do need to know this material, as many of these rules are relevant during your career. The learning objectives for this lab is 1, distinguish between safe and unsafe laboratory practices. 2, understand where relevant safety equipment is located in the lab. You just know what the relative safety equipment is. And 3, understand how to safely dispose of contaminated materials. So microbiologists observe a number of safety rules while they're working in the lab. You will be quizzed on these safety rules. And it's important to understand them because you will use them in your career, in your real life, assuming you get a job in the health profession. All right, so first, wear proper attire, which includes a lab coat covering your lap when sitting. It has to be button closed. You must wear disposable gloves. You must have closed-toed shoes. And if you're working with a splash hazard, you must wear goggles. Goggles are generally not used in the microbiology lab because most of the time you would not be working with a splash hazard. However, a liquid culture could splash into your eye. So whenever you have a liquid culture, you have to wear goggles. The goggles will remain in the lab and they're supplied by the lab. Long hair, if you have long hair, should be tied back once you come into the microbiology lab. No food or drink at any time in the lab. No use of electronics. Absolutely no personal items are allowed in the main part of the lab, including cell phones. And remember, the door and the cabinets are not considered part of the lab. All personal items are to be stored in the cabinets by the main lab door. If a personal item is to be brought into the lab proper, it will be confiscated and not returned until after being soaked in bleach for 15 minutes or put in the autoclave. And that would destroy electronics. So when you come into the lab, you'll be looking something like this, wearing closed-toed shoes, wearing pants, wearing a shirt which is not shown, wearing a lab coat, wearing gloves. And I think that's the person's glasses. I don't believe those are goggles. And this person has a hairnet on. We just have hair ties. No food, no drinks, no cell phones, no headphones. Not shown would be you can, well, glasses is something you can bring in. Jewelry, if she had earrings on or a necklace. I think that's a necklace right there. May be brought into the lab. Obviously, her shoes, the pants, and the shirt are brought into the lab as well. Keep your work area clean. So before you begin, you should disinfect your area and then wipe it down. And then after you leave the lab, you should disinfect where you've been working and then wipe it down. Here is an actual position of what our microbiology lab actually looks like. And the student would be working, this one right here, working right there. There's a microscope. There's a bacterial incinerator. You know, I don't think this is the microbiology lab because that's got a computer screen. It might be an old microbiology lab. We have laptops for use in the microbiology lab. We don't have a computer screen. Discard waste in the appropriate receptacles. Regular trash that is not contaminated, no sharp objects, like no glass, can go in the regular trash can as long as it's not contaminated. If it is contaminated and it's not glass, then it goes in the biohazard container. And as you can see, this has a plastic thing in it that'll be pulled out and then autoclaved, and then it will be discarded in the regular trash. But it will be autoclaved before going in the regular trash. No glass goes in here, no sharps. We don't really use sharps in microbiology. We have a biohazard container for anything that's contaminated with microbes. Agar plates, which are plastic plates, are put in there when you're done with them. Contaminated test tubes are put in the place for putting tubes. We have a rack for putting used tubes. We don't really use bottles, but those will go by the test tubes if you have them. For swabs, we have a container which has disinfectant in it, put the swab in it. For the slides, we have a container for putting glass slides. The glass slides will be, well, they're disinfected in the bleach, and then they will be washed, and then they'll be reused. We do not have reused cover slips, so they would just go in a container for cover slips, and then they would go in the bleach in the container, and then they would just be discarded. All material that are contaminated or potentially pathogenic must be sterilized before use. So unless it's got glass, it would go in the biohazard bag. Reports all spills and accidents immediately, no matter how slight. Cover the materials with paper towels, saturate it with a disinfectant, allow the disinfectant to soak for 15 minutes, and then discard the biohazard material, wipe it up with dry paper towels, put it in the biohazard container. The exception would be if it has glass. If it has glass, remove the paper towel and then pick up the glass with a broom and a dustpan, put the glass in the broken glass container, and then wipe it up with paper towels and put it in the biohazard container. Keep lids and reagent bottles when not in use, meaning keep the lid covered. Never pour reagents back into the containers. Do not pour chemicals down the drain or in the trash without permission. Generally, for toxic substances, we have a place to put it, a container to put toxic substances. No mouth pipetting, no putting fingers in your mouth. You'll have gloves on, but no putting gloved fingers in your mouth, no putting pencils in your mouth or in your ears or nose. When a Bunsen burner and a backdoor incinerator are in use or going to be used, they may be on, but after you've done using them, they should be turned off. It's especially true for the Bunsen burner. This is showing you a backdoor incinerator. You sterilize the instrument by putting it in there until it becomes red hot. You can see it's starting to get red hot in that region right there. So make sure it's red hot before pulling it out to use it. You need to cool it before picking up cells. Be familiar with the safety equipment. Some of it's shown here. A fire alarm. That's a first aid kit. I think that's a fire blanket there. A deluge shower, like if you were to get chemicals spilled all over you, you can go wipe yourself, get yourself under a shower. The trouble with that is this shower literally goes on the floor. So it'd make a mess. And we do have a drain underneath the shower, but the floor will be sopping wet. So fortunately, I've never had a student have to use that. The eye wash station, if you get something spilled in your eyes, you should go to the eye wash station and get it washed out. I've only seen the eye wash station used once, and that was long before I was teaching. I was actually in graduate school, and a doctor got something spilled, a chemical spilled in his eye, and I took him to the eye wash station and had him use his eye wash station. The only time I've ever seen it used. Yeah, really used. Uh, I'm not sure what that alarm is because that's the fire alarm. There's the fire extinguisher, and that's some of the lab safety equipment. All of these things are in the lab. Fortunately, I've never seen them used in the lab. All right, so pre-read the lab before the lab. It's especially true if you were to come into the lab. Obviously, it's not as important on an online lab. It'll just take you longer. All right, laboratory procedures and safety rules. Never take shortcuts. Use the procedures that you are shown and taught in this lab. And I'm not going to really show you, but I will discuss them. Actually, some of them I will show. That's true. There are a few I will show. Safety is of primary importance in a microbiology lab. You're not allowed to take any personal items to your lab bench. They must remain in the cabinet. Papers and pens may be brought into the lab, but once they're brought into the lab, they have to stay in the lab until they are sterilized. You're required to follow these rules. And if you were to come into the lab, you'd actually sign a sheet saying you agree to follow the lab rules. We don't have a sheet in the online class. All right, I'm not going to talk about the penalties because it really doesn't apply to us. Only enrolled microbiology students are permitted in the lab unless authorized by the instructor. All personal items, books, bags must be in the cabinet, which is considered outside of the lab. Personal items should not be brought into the lab proper, and you should never access things in the cabinet while you have your lab coat on and your gloves. You should remove the gloves, remove your lab coat, go wash your hands before you access anything in the cabinet. Cell phone use is prohibited. We actually do have a phone in the lab, which you could use. And I'm not going to talk about it because we're not going to go into the real lab. Anything that should not be in the lab will be confiscated and you're not getting it back until it has been sterilized in bleach or autoclaved. You should consider all cultures you're working with to be potentially pathogenic. Keep hands, pencils, and other materials out of your mouth, your ears, your nose, etc. You're always required to wear gloves, which are provided for in the lab. You should also, while you were in microbiology, monitor yourself for possible infection with a bacteria. And we have a document in the class detailing information for students and physicians in case you were to get sick from a microbe that is in the microbiology lab. That's not terribly important because we're not going to work with real microbes. Everything we do will be online. But let me show you where that document is. I think it's week 1 lab. It's not here. Oh, there it is, biosafety information for students and physicians. So if you were to get sick, you take that information to your physician and it would tell you, I think, which cultures we're working with in the lab. Okay, here. Closed-toed shoes must be worn at all times in the lab. Lab coats are also required. They must be completely buttoned. You may use a lab coat supplied for you in the lab, or you may bring in your own. Once you bring in your own, it must remain in the lab until the end of the term, which case it will be autoclaved and then washed before you can take it home. Goggles must be worn at all times whenever there's a splash hazard. And then you must clean down your lab bench before and after you're done working. I'm not going to talk about accidents because I already talked about that. All right, any questions about Lab 00? If not, open up the worksheet and begin working on the worksheet. This worksheet is due by 8 a.m. Friday morning, so make sure you get it submitted there. Fill in the answers to each asterisk. Like rule 1 must supply 4 answers. Otherwise, you won't get full credit. Any question about the lab? All right, go ahead and get started. I will be here until 8 o'clock, or the last student logs out. Once the last student logs out, I'm going to log out as well. So if you have any questions, make sure you ask before the last student logs out. But I am here to help you with the lab. That's why I stay in the lab until the last student logs out.